long time. So what I'm going to do is do an overview of Darwin's career with particular emphasis on the importance of his visit to South Africa during the voyage of the Beagle. Charles was born in 1809 and died in 1882. So his career spanned one of the most eventful and exciting centuries in the history of Western civilization. Some of the big events, for instance, in 1807, the abolition of slavery, at least in Europe, and that emblem on the top left is a porcelain emblem made by Josiah Wedgwood, the famous potter who established the Wedgwood Empire, who became Charles's maternal grandfather. It was an era of the first and second industrial revolutions, great technological innovations, voyages of discovery, the great exhibitions in Paris and London and New York, opening up of new museums and new libraries, and advances in education at all levels, and especially in informal science education, as shown here, demonstration in the Linnaean Society. And as Charles Dickens wrote at the time, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was a perfect age in which to make a great discovery. Charles came from a very happy and well-funded family, aristocratic family. There's his young sister, Catherine, with whom he shared most of his life. Unfortunately, his mother died at the age of 8, so he was brought up by aunts and grandparents. He was a rather rebellious youth who didn't naturally fit into the boxes that Victorian society required of you, or early 19th century society. For instance, at school, he was a very lackluster student, and he commented that school as a main means of education to me was simply a blank. Of course, in those days, they had a very classical education with lots of Latin and Greek and literature, etc. There was no science in the curriculum at all. Science only entered the British curriculum in 1840. So he was very frustrated in class, and he mainly educated himself by going out into the countryside, collecting rocks and minerals, occasional fossils, collecting insects such as butterflies, moths and beetles, like lots of little boys do. But he didn't ever collect birds' eggs and birds' nests. That's one thing he avoided. His father was a very proud man who had high hopes for young Charles and was very frustrated that he didn't perform well at school. So his father withdrew him from school in Shrewsbury and sent him to Edinburgh University to study medicine, and thus following the family tradition, because his father was a medical doctor, as was his grandfather, Erasmus. Unfortunately, this experiment failed miserably. Once again, Charles was bored by the lectures. He was nauseated by amputations without anesthetics, and basically his time, once again, out in the countryside. He learned how to ride horses, he became an expert shot and hunter, and continued to collect minerals and fossils and rocks, etc. He did meet a very interesting person at Edinburgh, and that's John Edmonston, who was an emancipated slave from Guyana, who had accompanied a British naturalist to the Amazon, and on that expedition had learned the skills of taxidermy. And Charles actually did a course with this ex-slave and learned the techniques of taxidermy. So that experiment failed. He never completed his medical degree. And his father, Robert, commented at the time, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs and rat catching, and you'll be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." And that's the sort of cloud under which Darwin would spend the rest of his career until his father died when Charles was 39. Anyway, Robert Darwin withdrew him from Edinburgh and sent him to Cambridge University to study theology. And Charles quite liked this idea because he reckoned that life as a country parson would give him plenty of time to pursue his interest in natural history. And of course, that's the way a lot of science was done at that time, where you had a profession which generated some income, and then you had time to spend on your hobby and often became very expert in your hobby. And the famous geologist James Lyell, for instance, he trained and practiced as a barrister before he became a geologist. And that's perhaps why he was able to formulate and present arguments so forcefully in his later career. Anyway, at Cambridge, Charles put a bit more of an effort into his studies. He succeeded in passing his degree and effectively qualified as a minister of the church. But he also made very valuable contacts there. For instance, the professor of botany, who was a theologist, John Henslow, recognized Charles' potential, encouraged him in his research in natural history, and in fact subsequently became the contact person. When Charles collected specimens during the voyage of the Beagle, he would pack them up into crates and send them to John Henslow, who would distribute them to experts for identification and comment. His time at Cambridge was also characterized by lots of trips out into the field, and he started to develop a wanderlust, having read the books of von Humboldt and on the Arctic explorers, etc. He realized that, he was not going to be satisfied with his settled occupation of a country parson. He really wanted to pursue his natural history instincts. And the same applied to John Henslow, but in contrast to Darwin, the furthest John Henslow ever travelled out of Great Britain was the Isle of Wight. Now, his early geological explorations, as I've mentioned, Henslow, to whom he sent the Beagle specimens. He learned the principles of geological mapping and structural geology with Adam Sedgwick on a field trip to Wales, which lasted several months. And he read about Charles Lyell's theory of uniformitarianism, which I'll come back to. Now, some of the people who influenced Darwin's early career, firstly, his paternal grandfather, Erasmus, who was a remarkable man, a philosopher, an investor, an inventor, and one of the most respected minds in Western Europe at the time, and also one of the founders of the Lunar Society of Birmingham, which basically fomented the development of the first industrial revolution from the 1780s onwards. Erasmus Darwin was also a well-known author, and one of the books he published was called Zoonomia, The Laws of Organic Life. And in that, he makes the intriguing statement about evolution, that from their first rudiments to the termination of their lives, all animals undergo perpetual transformations, and many of these acquired forms are transmitted to their posterity. Now, that's an idea that was decades ahead of its time. It was completely contrary to the teachings of the Church of England, which was very powerful, because basically the creationist story from the Church of England was that life on Earth, plants and animals, were unchanging since their initial creation by deity, and also that the Earth, after the cataclysmic flood of Noah's time, had basically remained the same ever since then. And Erasmus Darwin anticipated Charles Darwin's theory and questioned the teachings of the Church of England. Another influence was Thomas Malthus, who wrote about human population growth and how that growth will always be controlled by a limited number of resources. In other words, there will be a struggle for existence and a struggle for survival. And that has made some historians think that Darwin's theory came not out of his studies in the jungle, in other words, out in the natural countryside, but actually were initiated through Thomas Malthus's work, which was about humans in cities, looking at the mechanism for change and evolution and the controls on population growth, and then having developed the theory on the basis of that, he transferred it to the jungle. Another early influence was Sir Richard Owen, who had a sort of love-hate relationship with Darwin. He was a leading paleontologist in Britain at the time, the first director of the Natural History Museum, the man who coined the word dinosaur. And Darwin sent most of the fossil backboned animals that he collected on the Beagle voyage to Owen, who identified them and published on them. So on that level, they were active scientific collaborators. But Richard Owen was very much a creationist. He refused to believe that biodiversity had evolved through a natural process, and so he was an active opponent of Darwin's theory throughout his career. Now, Lyell, the geologist, had a very important influence on Darwin. In fact, Darwin would later write that if it wasn't for the principles, the origin would never have happened. And what he's saying there is that if it wasn't for Lyell's 3-volume book, The Principles of Geology, his theory of the origin of species could never have evolved. Because Darwin was very aware that all change is initiated through geological change, through physical change of the Earth's crust, and that is then followed by reactive adaptations by plants and animals. And Lyell also made the intriguing statement in his book that if the physical environment is changing, then plants and animals would also have to change in order to remain adapted. He didn't embellish on it, he didn't propose a mechanism, but he made that thought, and that thought stuck in Darwin's mind throughout the voyage of the Beagle. So it's important to realize that when Darwin embarked on the Beagle voyage, he was actually more of a geologist than he was a biologist, but he wasn't qualified in either of them. But the qualities he did have is he was very determined to prove that he could have a successful career, in contradiction to the predictions of his father and later of Fitzroy. And he had acquired a number of practical skills that equipped him well for the expedition. Now, there had been some prior voyages around the world which took naturalists along, and perhaps the most famous was Sir Joseph Banks, the botanist who went on James Cook's first petrolling voyage in the 1770s. But Darwin was the first naturalist with a decent knowledge of geology and a developing knowledge of biology to transnavigate the world. After qualifying at Cambridge, Darwin returned to the family home, and then, out of the blue, a letter arrived from the Admiralty. A letter inviting Charles Darwin to be interviewed for the post of naturalist on the round-the-world cruise of the Beagle, which would be skippered by Captain Robert Fitzroy. Fitzroy was a major player in Darwin's early life. He came, the British naval officer, came from a very aristocratic naval family. He was a typical authoritarianism, and he was a phrenologist who believed in the pseudoscience that you can predict someone's character by the bumps on the head in the shape of their nose. And he was quite proud of his nose. It was a sort of noble nose, which to him personified devotion to duty, etc. Whereas when he met Darwin, he was unimpressed with his snout. He felt that, you know, it showed laziness and lack of discipline, etc. But fortunately, he was wrong, and he subsequently changed his mind and agreed to employ Darwin. Fitzroy also had an explosive temper. His nickname with the crew of the Beagle was Hot Coffee, and whenever the cry went out that the coffee is boiling, everyone knew that Fitzroy was in a temper and you stayed out of his way. And he was deeply religious, so although he supported Darwin's work and even co-authored some of the papers, descriptive papers that came out of the Beagle voyage with Darwin, he never agreed with Darwin's theory. Interestingly, after the Beagle voyage, Fitzroy had quite a distinguished career. He became Britain's first scientific meteorologist and weather forecaster. He invented an accurate barometer, which he distributed all around the coast of England for weather forecasts. He became the governor of New Zealand, but sadly committed suicide at the end of his life. And one of the reasons why he had asked the Admiralty to find a suitable gentleman to accompany him on the voyage was because he was aware of the impact of loneliness on long sea voyages. His own uncle had committed suicide as a result of loneliness on long sea voyages. So he wanted someone, a gentleman, with whom he could share his scientific tastes and basically have conversations and remain entertained and inspired. Because we must remember the crew of those ships in those days typically consisted of 12 to 15-year-old boys. Most of them had never been to school or just done 1 or 2 years of schooling, so they were effectively illiterate. Now, the kind of 5-year romantic voyage that the Fitzroy and Darwin did together worked out remarkably well considering how different their characters were. Fitzroy was a conservative Tory who condoned slavery, and his main priority in life was to maintain the privileged status quo that he had in society and the respect of his peers. Darwin had the opposite point of view. He was a progressive Whig who respected human rights, abhorred slavery, and was much more interested in change and progress than maintaining the status quo. So they were really at opposite ends of thinking during the early Victorian era. So there we have the HMS Beagle, a 10-gun brig sloop with a crew of 74, and fully equipped for defending itself. In fact, it did fire its cannons during a coup d'etat that happened in South America while they were in Argentina. But it was a ship that had been equipped to do hydrographic surveys. And Fitzroy's brief was basically to continue the Admiralty's hydrographic surveys of the east and west coasts of South America and along the southern trade route past Australia, the Cape of Good Hope, and back into the Atlantic Ocean. So that was the main goal of the voyage. But the Admiralty also realized that research on land would be useful, and that is why Darwin was taken along. So wherever they made landfall, Darwin would go onto land and in South America spend weeks on land collecting geological, zoological, and botanical specimens and sending them back to England. There's a diagram of the Beagle, very cramped, 74 crew on board. Darwin had to share the cramped little cabin of the captain and slept for 5 years in a hammock suspended from the roof of the captain's cabin. There's the route they took. So from Southampton across the Atlantic, calling in at the Cape Verde Islands and Canary Islands, making landfall in Bahia. And there Darwin was horrified to see Fitzroy carried into town by on a sedan chair on the shoulders of 4 near-naked slaves. And this was one of the main controversies, main conflicts they had, in that Darwin abhorred slavery and Fitzroy condoned it. The first place they visited, but they couldn't go on land due to a cholera outbreak, was the Canary Islands. But there Darwin was able to see the impact of a recent volcanic eruption, how it totally changed the landscape. And during his voyage, he actually made more observations and collected more data and specimens than Lyell had to support his theory of uniform materialism. In the Cape Verde Islands, he was able to go on land, and there he saw, for instance, volcanic lava overlaying sedimentary rock which overlay lava, and he realized that Lyell was absolutely right, that the structure of the Earth is constantly changing, it's not staying the same, and it's changing due to the very same processes that continue today. In other words, sedimentation, erosion, volcanic action, earthquakes, etc. In South America, while Fitzroy was offshore doing his surveys, Darwin had a good look at the geology, botany, and zoology. The rhea is one of the animals he reported on. He also made notes on alpacas. And one of the interesting observations he made after he visited the Cape of Good Hope was that the mammals in South America seemed to be much smaller than those in Africa, even though the vegetation there was much more luxuriant. One of many observations he made. And to show how observant he was, on one of their offshore cruises, they were subjected to a very heavy sandstorm. And while everyone else rushed down below decks, Darwin rushed onto deck, put out some sheets and collected the sand and examined it under his microscope and found that it had lots of plant spores and seeds in it. And he realized that that's one of the ways that plants disperse themselves. So he was always on the lookout for unexpected events. We tend to think of science as, Eureka, I found it. But another even more important statement is, that's funny. In other words, something that doesn't fit and that you need to look at and determine its cause. Darwin also found numerous fossils in South America, such as this one, a Glyptodon and a giant armadillo. And he was amazed by how similar the fossil of that giant armadillo was to living armadillos, which were a fraction of their size. And he found that over and over again with extinct horses, extinct elephant-like animals, and various antelope, that the extinct ones were bigger but very similar to the smaller living ones. He also had an unusual habit, which was shared by other Victorian explorers, that in addition to making notes on the structure and function and habitats and food, etc., of the animals he observed, he also tasted to see what they tasted like. So in his diaries you can find records of him eating beetles and wasps and lizards and snakes and tasting things and recording what they taste like. It's something that biologists today don't seem to do. They also visited the extreme southern end of South America, Terra del Fuego, where they found extremely primitive people, basically dressed in loincloths, living in the icy cold southern end of South America. And then he made a comment which would probably be perceived today as racist, but remember, he was quite a liberal person. How great the difference between the savage and civilized man is. It is greater than between a wild and a domesticated animal. And it's interesting that previously Fitzroy had visited Terra del Fuego and had taken some Terra del Fuegans to England to try and civilize them, and then brought them back, but the experiment failed completely. They then sailed up the west coast of South America, and Darwin was very fortunate in his mind to experience during that time an earthquake. The ground actually shook under him and he saw the impact of an earthquake. Further north, he experienced the impact of a tsunami, and all of this helped to support Lyell's theory and his belief in that theory. And eventually, when he reached the Galapagos Islands, he reached certain conclusions. Firstly, that the biblical age of the Earth, 4,000, 6,000 years, cannot be true. It must be much, much older in order for all the geological and evolutionary processes to have occurred. Secondly, he was convinced that the physical habitat is constantly changing, and therefore plants and animal species must change to remain adapted and to pass the inherited characters on to future generations. He also realized that all change is geological in origin initially, and that then is followed by biological change. What he didn't have, the missing piece in the puzzle, was a mechanism for the evolution of plant and animal. Now, there is a myth in the popular literature that when Darwin got to the Galapagos Islands and he observed the giant tortoises and the iguanas and also what are now called Darwin's finches, that it all came together and he developed his theory of evolution on the basis of his observations at Galapagos. But that is not true. He collected specimens in the Galapagos, which he took back to England and which were subsequently identified. And for instance, an ornithologist, John Gould, examined the finches. And only 6 years after Darwin got back to London, that Gould revealed that, in fact, there were different species of finches on the different Galapagos Islands, and then Darwin could develop his ideas around that. So although valuable data in support of his theory was collected in the Galapagos, it was many years later before he came up with his theory. But he nevertheless had ideas, embryonic ideas, developing in his mind regarding this final piece of the puzzle. And during the long voyage from the Galapagos across the Pacific Ocean, they called in various Pacific islands in New Zealand, Australia, Tasmania, Mauritius, and then eventually arrived at the Cape of Good Hope. During all of that time, Darwin had months and months at sea to think about his ideas, start to sort of congeal his hypotheses. But what he needed more than anything was English-speaking, articulate and knowledgeable scientists to share his ideas with and debate with, because he hadn't come across any knowledgeable English-speaking scientists during the whole 4.5 years of the voyage so far. And that was one of the main benefits of his visit to the Cape of Good Hope. He was fortunate to meet 3 top scientists and to start to bounce his ideas off them. Before we deal in detail with his Cape visit, I'd like to make a few comments about island research. During the voyage, Charles realized islands are a very important environment in which to study evolution. He spent a total of 122 days on islands. He investigated volcanic islands, non-volcanic islands, and several oceans. He studied in detail the Keeling Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. He defined various reef types, which he subsequently published on. And in fact, he was even cheeky enough subsequently to disagree with Lyell on how atolls are formed. Because Lyell had suggested that atolls are formed as a result of upliftment, and they were basically the rims of ancient volcanic craters, whereas Darwin showed that they were as a result of subsidence and the growth of living coral up to the water surface to form the atoll. And although Lyell was somewhat upset by this, he finally had to agree with Darwin was right. And he also hypothesized and proved to be correct that islands are made of either volcanic rock or modern coral rock, and that they are very important because it's easy to study variation within species and between species on islands that are separated by sea. So some of his geological observations before he reached the Cape of Good Hope were the geology of a volcanic island, the Cape Verde. He experienced, as I mentioned, the great Chilean earthquake. He experienced a tsunami and looked at the impact. He also, in the Andes, discovered marine fossils high up in the mountains and realized that sea levels must have changed, or there must have been considerable uplift. And he realized the importance of island biogeography and that islands divide species. But we also need to recognize that towards the end of the voyage, he suffered a great deal. They traveled through uncharted waters. They experienced terrible storms, which nearly wrecked them on several occasions. He wasn't a particularly good sailor, so he got seasick often. He was injured. He had to deal with dangerous wild animals in South America. He contracted Chagas disease in Brazil. They even had to deal with armed bandits, and on one occasion, one of their party was killed by an armed bandit. Darwin survived. And the long months at sea, combined with conflicts with Fitzroy, resulted in him becoming very lonely and homesick. So when he arrived at the Cape, this is the way he felt in a letter to Henslow. "Oh, the degree to which I long to be once more living quietly with not one single novel object near me." He just didn't want any more novelty. He wanted to be back in a comfortable environment where he could give thought to what he'd found. No one can imagine it until he has been whirled around the world during 5 long years in a 10-gun brig. So, unfortunately, Darwin visited the Cape of Good Hope at a time when he was homesick, tired, and in fact, he recorded very little in his log of the Beagle about his visit to the Cape. But fortunately, he got into voluminous correspondence with the people he met in the Cape. So that's, in fact, where most of the information about his visit comes from. So that's what Charles would have looked like at the time he visited the Cape. So he was 27 years old, and because the Table Bay wasn't as yet protected, the official anchorage at the time was Simon's Bay, and they dropped anchor in Simon's Bay or Simonstown on the 31st of May 1836 and stayed until the 19th of June. That was the extent of the Cape Colony at the time, much smaller than it is now. And I've mentioned the names of some naturalists who had previously visited the Cape Colony. And Darwin was aware of their work. Some of them were geologists, others were botanists, zoologists, and he didn't want to repeat their work or repeat the collection of specimens. So he did a relatively limited amount of collecting in the Cape. He mainly focused on discussions. So a characteristic of his Cape visit, he spent more time, 19 days in the Cape, than at any other landfall except for those in South America. He knew that the fauna, flora and geology had been relatively well documented, so he didn't record much, but he did meet famous scientists and he did do a tour of the Overberg, and he was keen to return home. So the first thing he did from Simonstown was do some rambles among the boulders and the Cape Fynbos and the coastal areas near Simonstown. The first scientist they met was Sir Thomas McClare, who was the Astronomer Royal at the Royal Astronomical Observatory and Observatory, which had been established 11 years earlier. And the main object of that visit was for Captain Fitzroy to calibrate the 28 chronometers that they had on board the Beagle, which are essential for navigation. The second scientist he met was Sir Andrew Smith, who ironically had trained as a medical doctor at Edinburgh University, had joined the military, had been posted to the Cape of Good Hope, and there, like many military men, he developed a passion for a particular branch of science and became the leading zoologist in the colony and the first director of the South African Museum from 1828. Smith was a descriptive zoologist and taxonomist who was the first to describe and give names to some familiar animals, including the largest living fish, the whale shark, the crowned eagle, girdle lizards, rock pythons. He named over 40 new species of birds. So he was a very active zoologist, doing just the right thing at the beginning of zoology in the Cape of Good Hope. He had recently returned from an extensive expedition which had gone as far north as the Limpopo River, and he shared his observations with Darwin. For instance, the vast herds of springbuck and wildebeest and zebra that he'd seen, which Darwin wouldn't see because they had basically been decimated in the area that Darwin explored. Smith also told him about the quokkas, which of course were still living then and would only go extinct 32 years later, 42 years later. Smith also told Darwin about the succulent karoo, which I think Darwin would have found absolutely fascinating, but unfortunately didn't travel far inland enough to see it. And he told Darwin and showed him specimens of fossils, for instance, of the extinct giant buffalo. The only collecting that Darwin did in the Cape was of small insects and so on, which he knew hadn't been well collected. But he also made copious notes on what he observed. Now, you'll all be familiar with the Sea Point contact, which is in Bantry Bay. It had been discovered 18 years earlier by Clark Abel, but Smith took Darwin there and they had a good look at it. And you're far better qualified to interpret it than I am, but basically, as Darwin said, it exposed in clear sight the eruption of ancient igneous rock from deep within the Earth's mantle and its intrusion into sedimentary rock, which had been partly metamorphosed already and produced metamorphic rock. So although Darwin didn't discover it, he was one of the first to analyze and contextualize it in relation to Lyell's uniformitarianism. So some of his geological observations: firstly, Neptunism, that all rocks were formed by precipitation, which was the view before Lyell, that was overturned. Plutonism, that both igneous and sedimentary origins of rocks, was confirmed, but the existence of a third kind of rock, metamorphic, was also confirmed. And Darwin's observations revealed the creative power of natural landscapes that change over time, so supporting Lyell, and he confirmed Lyell too that the Earth is forever changing and is much older than the biblical 6,000 years, and that these changes are caused by the same forces that are acting today. One of the most important things that Darwin did during his visit to the Cape was he did a 4-day horse ride into the interior, which Andy Smith organized. And Darwin comments in his diary, I hired a couple of horses and a young Hottentot groom to accompany me as a guide. He spoke English very well as Dutch and Afrikaans, and was most tidily dressed. He wore a long coat, beaver hat, and white clothes. So this was the man who accompanied Darwin, and he turned out to be a perfect guide because he also had a good knowledge of the local people and of the local plants and animals. And there's the route that they took from Cape Town, basically along the route of the N1 to Paarl, where Darwin examined the giant boulders. They then went up the Franschhoek Valley, over the Franschhoek Pass to Hohoek, which was already operational that time, the oldest hotel in South Africa, and then back over the Strandveld of the Cape Flats to Cape Town. And that gave Darwin a little bit of a glimpse of the hinterland of Cape Town, but unfortunately didn't go far enough to see the succulent karoo and big herds. So he went to Paarl Rock and collected specimens there. They rode up the Franschhoek Valley, and there they met French and Dutch settlers. And remember that the abolition of slavery in the colonies only happened in 1833. So it was just 3 years before Darwin was there. And the whole deal was that for the first year after the date of abolition, the slaves were apprenticed to their masters, and only after that were they free. So it had all happened very recently, and Darwin was able to interview the Dutch and French burghers who were very unhappy with the role that the missionaries had played in the abolition of slavery, because suddenly they didn't have free labor anymore. So abolishment effectively took place in 1834, and one of the first papers that Darwin published, together with Fitzroy, was about the role of missionaries in the abolition of slavery. Some of his sociological observations, firstly, abhorred slavery and its remnants in the Cape. He noted how the settlers resented the role of the missionaries. He predicted that humans probably originated in Africa. He noted the great variations by inhuman races, and somewhat controversially suggested that the mental faculties of different races are unevenly distributed. So after visiting Franschhoek, they went up the Franschhoek Pass, which used to be the route that elephants and eland and antelope followed from the Karoo down into the lush Franschhoek Valley, where the elephants gave birth and looked after their young. And in fact, the first name for Franschhoek was Olifantsfontein. So they rode up the Franschhoek Pass, they went through the Geoscientists Valley and up the Hohoek Pass and stayed at the Hohoek Inn, and then down Sir Larry's Pass and back to Cape Town. So his ecological observations, although he was initially unimpressed by the small shrub-like, small-leaved fynbos plants and restios, proteas and leucodendrons, the more he looked, the more he realized how incredibly special it is in terms of plant diversity and the number of different pollinating agents, insects as well as reptiles that were involved. And as I said, he noted that African mammals are larger than those he saw in South America, although the vegetation is much less. And he also noted that the large game had largely been decimated in the vicinity of Cape Town. And his attitude towards this is that's an inevitable consequence of civilization. He wasn't particularly concerned about it. This was some 50 years before the modern conservation movement actually started. So he didn't see it as something that would eventually impact on humans. But the most important person that Darwin met in the Cape was John Herschel, later Sir John Herschel. He was a very prominent astronomer, as his father had been, and he was in the Cape for 4 years, from 1834 to 1838, initially to observe the passage of Halley's Comet, but also to be one of the first persons to document the southern skies. And there you can see some of his achievements in naming over 1,700 nebulae and star clusters, 1,300 pairs of double stars, etc. He was also a pioneer of photography. He actually coined the term photography, and positive and negative, and he was one of the first people to take celestial photographs, in other words, photographs of the night sky, and to experiment with color photography. But from Darwin's point of view, let me just mention this. Herschel was a very distinguished astronomer, but he was greatly embarrassed in 1835 when an American journalist who learnt about the giant telescope that Herschel had built in Cape Town suggested that Herschel had seen life on the moon. Now, of course, Herschel hadn't seen that, but this journalist made a big fuss of it, published a whole lot of articles, and there was a sort of scandal around the world about this prominent astronomer claiming his life on the moon. And Herschel was a very serious type, and he was not amused by this hoax. This is the house in Claremont that Herschel lived with his glamorous wife, Margaret, called Feldhazen. Margaret was a remarkable person in her own right, expert botanical artist, socialite, and they entertained Darwin on 2 occasions. And Darwin had the first opportunity really to discuss with a knowledgeable scientist some of his ideas. Now, not much is recorded at the time Darwin was in the Cape, but we learn a lot from the letters that were written. And John Herschel, one of the comments he makes is, the best results come when the mind leaps forward by forming at once a bold hypothesis. And one of the most important things he did for Darwin was to tell him, you know, you've collected a unique body of evidence. Don't just describe it, use it to propose and test a big idea, what we would call an hypothesis today. And Darwin took that advice on board, because after the voyage of the Beagle, he wrote all his descriptive papers, but then spent the rest of his life testing his big idea. And then in a letter to Lyell, Herschel wrote, the origins of fresh species would be found to be a natural, in contradistinction to a miraculous process. In other words, he was saying that fresh species evolved through a natural process of evolution, what they call transformation in those days, not through the influence of some god. And though we perceive no indication of any process actually happening. So Herschel, although he was quite an orthodox religious person, realized that plants and animals were evolving or had evolved, but he proposed that those changes had stopped occurring in the past and were no longer going on. And of course, Darwin could not agree with him on that. So Herschel's main impact on Darwin was in terms of the scientific method. And he'd recently published a book, there it is, the Preliminary Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy, which sketched out the proper scientific method. That had a great influence on Darwin. He was far less influential in terms of the actual mechanism for evolution. And in fact, many years later, once Darwin had published The Origin of Species, one of the first persons he sent a copy to was John Herschel. And he was horrified to hear through the grapevine that Herschel's comment on his theory was it's a theory of higgledy-piggledy. In other words, he made a derogatory comment that biodiversity could not have happened through random processes that Darwin had predicted. It must have happened through some intervention by a deity. So they didn't ever agree on the theory of evolution, but by the time Herschel's higgledy-piggledy comments came about, Darwin's theory was very well established, very well supported, and he wasn't too concerned about it. So after those adventures in the Cape of Good Hope, the Beagle continued its voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, landfall in South America, and back to England. In London, after his return, Darwin had a hectic time. Because he'd sent so many specimens and notes and so on back to England, people were well aware of the discoveries that he'd made. And he was an absolute celebrity, not only in the scientific world, but in the public imagination as well. A public at that time that was very thirsty for scientific knowledge. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of London at the young age of 39 years. He received one of the highest honours of the Geological Society. But in his own self, he longed for tranquility, and he also became brooding. He began to think of wedlock. And in fact, in one of his diaries, he weighs up the pros and cons of getting married and decides that it's a good idea and proposed to his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and they were married in January 1839. And what Darwin was doing now was transitioning from his descriptive career to his career where he would propose and test his big hypothesis. So there, Emma and Charles, at the time that they were married in 1839. In 1842, they managed to leave London at last and settled into Downhouse in the idyllic countryside of Kent. Darwin's comment on Downhouse is that I think the house is very ugly, but it's got a beautiful garden. Because what he had in mind is a whole lot of experiments that he would do in his garden with plants, with pigeons, with earthworms, bumblebees and so on. So he wanted a place where he could experiment. And that's where they lived for the rest of their lives. Emma became a very supportive wife. Although she was deeply religious, she didn't interfere with Darwin's work and basically created an environment where he could think and work. And as Darwin commented, under the shelter of respective matrimony, I concocted one of the most revolutionary ideas in the history of science, totally upturned the believings of the Church of England and sciences of biology, geology, and sociology at the time. So she was supportive and caring, utterly devoted. She was a very good musician. She played the piano. They had 10 children. Sadly, 3 of them died in childhood. And 3 of their children, 3 of their sons, became accomplished scientists and engineers in their own right, all of them being elected as Fellows of the Royal Society of London. So there, Darwin on the right with his eldest son, William, and top left is his daughter, Anne, who tragically died at the age of 10, an event which greatly upset Darwin and dented his faith in religion and also dented his faith in the medical profession. We also need to remember that Darwin was quite a sickly man because he had contracted all sorts of diseases on the voyage of the Beagle, and throughout the rest of his life he was a relative invalid. There is an artist's impression of his study. Of course, Downhouse is now a museum. I've had the good fortune of visiting it and even played a cricket match on the cricket field nearby. And a characteristic of this stage of Darwin's life is the amount of corresponding he did. But let's have a look at his character. As I said, shy and sickly, he hated publicity. In fact, most of the events at which his theory was put to the public and the scientific community, he wasn't even there. He was noted even after the voyage of the Beagle for his patient and observant style of science. He was highly focused and practical, curious and innovative, and basically retained his childlike curiosity throughout his life. He was an excellent and devoted father, prolific correspondent, and very ethical. So his work environment, he didn't have any formal laboratory. He just had his house and his garden. He never had to work for a university, museum, or research institute because he'd inherited money from both the Darwin and the Wedgwood side. And this was an advantage to him because he didn't carry the baggage of having to support the ideology of a particular institution. He was a completely free thinker who could come up with novel ideas. He realized the importance of what we now call artificial selection. In other words, the way in which horticulturists and animal husbandrymen developed particular favourable traits in their plants and animals. He realised that this is actually an accelerated form of natural selection. So he attended agricultural shows, he had extensive discussions with farmers and animal and plant breeders, and understood the way in which they employed artificial selection. And he also cultured orchids and bred pigeons and learned a lot from that. The most important thing is, as Herschel had suggested, he found himself in a place where he could think, he had peace, and when he needed it, he had stimulation from visiting scientists. So there he is in his office. He had a small group of friends who frequently visited him, one of whom was the geologist Charles Lyell. And his science was old-fashioned observation, collection, and classification, but with a clear hypothesis in mind to propose and test. He was patient and unhurried. His friends kept saying, publish your ideas, someone's going to preempt you. He wasn't interested. He just wanted to continue collecting data so that when he published his hypothesis, it would be fully supported. And unlike a lot of scientists working for formal institutions, he wasn't driven by promotion or increased salary or recognition. He was driven by pure imagination and curiosity. And he was not elitist and not affected by the dogma and intellectual baggage. His motto was, let the data speak. And because of his environment, he was open-minded and therefore was able to come up with novel conclusions. Some of his household experiments, he did experiments on plant phototropism, in other words, how plants grow towards light. He used to boil down specimens in the kitchen. He made a model of the pollination mechanism of a particular orchid, which had a trigger mechanism that when a bee came into the flower, this trigger flicked pollen onto the bee. Because they didn't have plastic in those days, he cut a sliver of whalebone off his wife's corset to make that trigger mechanism. He used to dip feather dusters into flour and flick it onto bumblebees to see what their home range is, helped by his children. When his wife was playing the piano, he used to put jars of earthworms on the piano to see their reaction to vibrations. He measured the strength of plant roots. He did a whole lot of experiments. For 30 years, he studied barnacles and did experiments with them as well. So there we see him in his hothouse growing his orchids. This is his famous thinking walk, and on the right is his famous diagram where he writes at the top left, I think, and that's a sort of first cladogram, a branching diagram of evolution. His religious views, initially at least he was Anglican, quite deeply religious, but he challenged the biblical teaching at the time about the age of the earth, species changing. He also concluded that evolution is too cruel and wasteful to have been in the work of a beneficent God, and gave the example, for instance, of ichneumon wasps that lay their eggs inside the caterpillars of other insects, and those eggs then hatch and eat the caterpillar from the inside, and couldn't believe that a God would invent such a mechanism. His work threatened the power of the Church of England. As a result, he was never knighted. And he eventually died an agnostic, that is, believing that nothing can be known through science about God and religion. After he reached Darwin started to publish essays on his theory of evolution. And these essays over the years became more and more sophisticated, supported by more and more data. And when he bounced his ideas with Hooker and Lyell and others, they started to see just how profound his thinking was. But he delayed publication, firstly because he was afraid of controversy. He was afraid of being persecuted, as some other scientists who had proposed hypotheses that weren't well supported had been persecuted. He was sensitive to his wife's religious views. He was naturally a cautious person. and non-confrontational. But then a bombshell fell in his lap. He received a letter from another British naturalist with whom he'd been corresponding, Alfred Russel Wallace. He was collecting specimens which he sold to zoos and research labs, collecting them in Southeast Asia, and had made observations on what he thought the mechanism for evolution was. And he sent a description of this to Darwin. And to Darwin's horror, it was almost exactly the same as Darwin's theory, but with less supporting evidence. Darwin discussed this with Lyell and Hooker and so on, and they decided to present Wallace's letter together with Darwin's latest essay to the scientific community, which they did, and both of them received credit initially. But to Wallace's eternal credit, he was a real gentleman. He subsequently said, although I came up with similar ideas, the theory is Darwin's, because he has much more support of the idea than I did. And in fact, Wallace subsequently published a book called Darwinism, attributing it to Darwin. So in December 1859, following Wallace's letter, Darwin was forced to publish the latest of his essays in this famous book, The Origin of Species, which is regarded as one of the most important books in the history of science. And let's remember that one of the main motivations for him to have taken this route was his discussions with Herschel in the Cape of Good Hope. And even though Herschel didn't support his ideas, he gave him the impetus. Now, of course, this theory caused a lot of controversy initially. And one example I can give is the great evolution debate which occurred in June 1860 at the Oxford University Museum between Soapy Sam, who is a bishop, local bishop, Sam Wilberforce, and Thomas Huxley, who is known as Darwin's bulldog because he was an avid supporter of Darwin's theory. Typically, Darwin didn't even attend the event. Anyway, Wilberforce fiercely attacked Darwin's theory and had been briefed by Sir Richard Owen on how to do that, but Huxley defended it equally robustly, together with Joseph Hooker and John Lubbock. And it caused quite a stir. In fact, Lady Brewster fainted during the heat of the debate, and the wife of the bishop, on leaving the hall at the end of the debate, was heard to say, well, I hope it's not true, and if it is true, that it doesn't become commonly known. Anyway, Darwin's book has never been out of print since then. It's continued to be published and influenced people. It gave rise to all sorts of other fields of study, such as genetics, leading to so-called neo-Darwinism. But we must remember that the late 1800s was also the heyday of cartoonists and caricaturists. So Darwin didn't escape their attention. There are volumes of different cartoons about his work. Darwin had a really good sense of humor, so he thoroughly enjoyed these cartoons and even published some of them himself. So there you can see ridiculing his ideas that we might have been evolved from apes. And there's another cartoon. Darwin did a lot of experiments on earthworms and was the first to show their importance in fertilizing the soil. So this one is called Man is But a Worm. So what did Darwin discover? That evolution by natural selection is heritable change in living organisms, plants and animals, over many generations and millions of years to adapt to a changing environment. That changing environment starts with geological change and then is followed by biological change. And for natural history selection to occur, Earth and ecosystems must change. Space and food will always be limited, as Malthus proposed. And there's therefore a constant struggle for survival and survival of the fittest. Species must change to adapt. Each species in each generation produces random novelties when they breed in their offspring, and those novelties which are best adapted to the environment at that time are the ones that will survive, breed, and pass their heritable characteristics on to the next generation. And this can result in permanent heritable change. So he didn't propose that we evolved from baboons or monkeys, but that we had a common ancestor with them and have evolved in a different direction since then. So what did he achieve? He provided the mechanism for evolution, the missing piece of the puzzle. He upended the biblical version of creation, both geological and biological creation. He explained the origins of biodiversity, laid the foundation for a whole new suite of scientific disciplines, especially genetics. And from the point of view of a science educator, I think another very important thing he did is he changed the public perception of science, especially towards biology and geology. And when you look at the history of science, I think there are two scientists who did more than any others to both contribute to their discipline and change the public perception of science. And that's Dmitry Mendeleev, who developed the periodic table of chemical elements, which has great predictive value, and Darwin with his theory of evolution, which also has great predictive value. So they were not only great scientists, they were great communicators. In 2009, I attended some bicentenary celebrations of Darwin's birth, and I asked the question to the panel, what would surprise Darwin if he were to come back and visit us today? And these are some of the responses. Firstly, he'd be amazed by the extent of the fossil record. He'd be amazed by advances in genetics and genetic engineering. He would be surprised with his knowledge of domesticated animals, how few new species, domesticated animals, have been created. In Africa, only the guinea fowl has been added. He would be surprised by the number of people studying his theory today, but equally surprised by the rise of creationism and by human impact on the environment and the fact that science and religion aren't reconciled. And, you know, for instance, this sort of rubbish that you can find on Dr. Google, comment that there's a spider that today it looks exactly like its fossil 165 million years ago. You know, why do we need evolution? Things have changed, have remained the same. And a recent Gallup poll in the USA revealed that in some states, over 60% of people don't believe in evolution. In Western Europe, in countries like Belgium, Eurobarometer revealed even higher percentages of people rejecting evolution. Charles Darwin died in April 1882 at home in his bed of a heart attack. His wife Emma was at his side. His last words were, "I'm not afraid to die. Remember what a good wife you've been to me." Despite the way in which he'd upended the beliefs of the Church of England, he was accorded a full state funeral, which was attended by thousands of people, both supporters and opponents. He was buried in Scientist's Corner in Westminster Abbey, just a short way from Isaac Newton and next to Sir John Herschel. And recently, Stephen Hawking has been laid to rest right next to Darwin in Westminster Abbey. Now, I'd like to end with some comments on how Darwin's visits during the voyage of the Beagle have been commemorated. Even though he spent less time in Australia than in the Cape of Good Hope, they have in Australia an entire city named after him, Darwin, and in that city is the Charles Darwin University, and nearby is the Charles Darwin National Park. Elsewhere, there's a mountain named after Darwin in Zimbabwe, even though he didn't go there. There's another mountain in Chile named after him, and various geological features around. In 2009, a Darwin Trail was established in Cape Town, but it's kind of fallen apart. It was both a hiking and a cycling trail, but there's no sign of that anymore. So I've mounted a campaign through these talks to have a bronze bust of the young Charles Darwin, as he was when he visited the Cape, mounted in Jubilee Square in Simonstown. This well-known South African sculptor, Jan Steen, has created this beautiful clay maquette of the young Darwin. And it's not only a very good likeness, but it's actually done in the style of sculpture from the 1830s. And we're in the process of getting permission to mount the bronze of this bust in Jubilee Square, just a little bit away from the just use statute. So we will shortly be launching a fundraising campaign to raise money to cover the cost of casting the bronze, buying the granite plinth, and creating outdoor signage for it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everyone. That was a wonderful presentation. We are a bit late, but we'll gladly take a few questions, or Mike will take a few questions. Mike has also brought a lot of his books out today. If anyone's interested, once we pack up and start moving, I'm going to talk to Mike.
That's a very interesting question. You said that he was 39 years old when he came back to London. And you earlier said that his father died when he was 39 years old. Did his father ever see what he accomplished?
Unfortunately, his father died before the origin of the species was covered. Right on to make it see that. But his father would certainly be aware of the acclaim that he received after he returned from London, after he published his descriptive papers, etc. So I think that probably would have been reconciled when people realised the value of his career. All that early horse riding and rat shooting and so on that people find.
During his visit to Cape Town and on that journey, was there an opportunity for him to make a comment about Table Mountain and the flatness, and then he went through the Cape Fold Belt, Franschhoek Pass and coming back via Hoek. Did any of that come about?
Not really. Darwin was aware that Table Mountain had already been described by geologists and by travellers, so he didn't repeat that. He was intrigued by Cape Fold Mountains and Table Mountain sandstone and so on, but he didn't publish on it. He only published his novel observations.
Yeah, I can maybe comment on that as well. Hi, John Compton here. That's true, and he didn't say much about the geology at the Cape. He did focus primarily on the sea point contact, but that had already been quite well described. And it's sort of a shame he didn't look more carefully at the geology, because having experienced, as Mike said, the earthquake in Chile, and then also documented the subsidence of coral atolls, he was clearly on the path to making major contributions towards earth movements and plate tectonics. And it's too bad he didn't elaborate more on that at the Cape, for which there's a lot of evidence that was only later described. So that's just a comment. But thanks for a great talk, Mike.
Yeah, John, as you know, he did publish quite extensively on the geology of South America, and he's published his paper on the origin of atolls and of volcanic and non-volcanic islands. So it's not as if he didn't publish geological stuff, he just didn't do much of that in the Cape.
Right.